Previously on OVA Overview.
In fact, after reading the Wikipedia page about Tokyo Babylon, I'd like to talk about them on this channel at some point, and I expect them to be a much more interesting and perfected product than what I'm about to review today. Well, everyone, that day has finally arrived, and I must say that I'm very happy with that. Now, when I watched this pair of OVAs, that is the Tokyo Babylon OVA Part 1 and 2, I didn't quite know what to expect going off of my previous experiences with Clamp's work on the animated screen, that being X 1996. I expected some great visuals and lore, but since both pieces had very different production teams and are only tangentially related, I mean they take place in the same universe and have limited crossovers, but that's about it, I had no real idea of what to expect here. I am happy to say that though, while X is a visually stunning train wreck, Tokyo Babylon consists of a pair of tight, well-paced, and interesting stories focusing on smaller plots with smaller casts that are also visually stunning. It was a joy to watch both of these OVAs, and I think that they are legitimately great. Since both are around 50 minutes long, we'll explore both here, sometimes focusing on differing aspects, and then sometimes touching on some shared traits. Now starting off with some plot stuff, unlike X 1996, Tokyo Babylon doesn't try to tell the entirety of the source material in 90 minutes, but instead focuses on two standalone original stories within the Tokyo Babylon universe. For context, Tokyo Babylon is another creation of the legendary manga team Clamp, and tells of the medium Subaru Sumeragi and his supernatural adventures with his twin sister and his acquaintance Seishiro. This relationship doesn't make me uncomfortable because it's a homosexual one, but because it's one featuring a 9-year age gap, a minor, and a lot of weird, creepy tendencies and gaslighting when we really zoom in on it. At least from what I can tell from the research I've done. I haven't read the entirety of Tokyo Babylon, but judging by the context I have, it seems to be a very uncomfortable element of it. Although I think some of this might be intentional. But anyways, that's not really the point here, as the point here isn't the context, but instead these two great OVAs and how they succeed as standalone features set in a universe of great scale. Now part 1 focuses on Subaru's quest to help break the curse placed upon a construction site, a curse actively exploited by Mr. Nagumo to get his superiors killed and move up the corporate ladder. This sees Subaru team up with a hard-nosed detective, a sister of one of the victims, Ghost Dog, trademark, and Seishiro to get to the bottom of things and eventually break the curse while defeating Mr. Nagumo. OVA Part 2 sees Subaru form up another team to stop a serial killer lurking in the subway tunnels of Tokyo. This time he teams up with a hard-nosed detective, the daughter of one of the victims, who also has post-cognition psychic powers, and Seishiro to help stop the killer, which again, they eventually do. Now while both of these plot summaries are bare bones, I don't really want to spoil these movies, as I think you should probably watch them on your own. They're that short and can be found online, so not really that big of a deal, and I don't want 60% of this video to be just a plot summary. Getting into a critique of the films, they're great! They're great fun, and I think that they too show an excellent mastery of writing and pacing, especially when tackling a project like this. Starting with part 1, this clearly feels like a prototype, in which the creative team wanted to figure things out and really get their legs under them on how to write a Tokyo Babylon inspired movie. And it's apparent in some ways, but it's also done very well. It's not as objectively good as part 2, but it is still very good, and an obvious amount of thought and planning and care went into it. Planning and thought by Tatsuhiko Urahata, who wrote both pieces, and Koichi Shigira, who directed both pieces. Now I don't really mention writers-directors by name on this channel, but I do here simply because I think these guys did a great job, and I'm happy that they were smart enough to scale things down, and that we didn't try to cram everything into 90 minutes like we did with X 1996. No offense to Rintaro, I think his direction's fine in that movie, but that script needed to be cut down. Anyways, the script here, written by Urahara, is a very tight one, which does a good job balancing action and exposition. Enough is explained in, kind of slow-talking exposition scenes to allow us to feel like we know what's going on, and we feel relatively informed, but not enough to stop the movie. There's enough to let us know, hey, there's magic in this world, here's how some of it works, here's how some of the consequences manifest themselves, but it doesn't get to the point where that prevents us from seeing it in action. And the action scenes themselves, while not the most plentiful, or as spectacular as some of the ones in X, are still very good showings and ooze 90s anime stylings. In fact, one of the weird strengths of Part 1 is that, as well there are some relatively stagnant exposition shots every now and again, and there is a good amount of just explaining things here and there, it leads up to an epic anime action fight, featuring a magical dog and some guy trying to harness it for his own evil ends. And I really like that because it's a short enough movie where it can get away with all of these scenes building up to a single big payoff. And it does really pay off. Above all though, something that stuck out to me the most about these two pieces is their pacing. An excellent job was done crafting two standalone stories that let us see enough of the grand scale and lore of Tokyo Babylon and its universe to really enthrall us and draw us in, but the stories themselves are small scale enough to be easily digestible and enjoyed. Lore is present and dwelled upon at times here, but the stories themselves are small enough to enjoy little morsels of lore instead of being completely overwhelmed by them at both the expense of action scenes and character scenes and the actual standalone plot. There's no deluge of information here, and everything feels the right amount of accessible and explained. And that gets us to another thing which is done pretty decently here, which is the amount of character moments. On character moments, one of the oddest things about these movies is how the main characters focused on are not actually the main characters of the movie or the source material. Well, the main focus of the source material, and indeed the OVAs, are Subaru, Seishiro, and Hokoto, from what I've heard anyways. They kind of take a back seat in these OVAs, as Subaru instead focuses on helping other characters unique to the OVAs work their way through their own traumas, all the while helping them catch the killer. This means that those characters tend to have more presence and development than the main cast at points, but this somehow works. In the source material, Subaru is noted for being an extremely empathetic person after all, so it does make sense that he would put others first, and this in turn would require scenes for us to get to know these characters enough to relate to them and really have this pay off. And both OVAs do a good job of balancing that requirement with having Subaru in them enough so where we still know that he's the main character. Don't get me wrong, Subaru still has good character scenes and character moments, but I've never seen anything like this where a character's empathy reaches the point of surrendering screen time to another character who's only in this certain installation of a series. But again, it works pretty well here, and it does do a little bit of characterization on Subaru's part, as his constant mentioning of concern for these people does let us know that he is really a gentle soul at his core. Overall, the writing here is great and provides a very sturdy skeleton for both installments. Getting to the second installment, if the first was a prototype, then this is the refined final form. Part 2 is exactly what a sequel should be. It is a relatively original story within the same framework of the previous installation, all the while having much improved atmosphere, plot beats, production value, and basically everything else. Everything is simply better here. Part 1 has heart, and it's still a very good watch, but it's not always clear if the budget or time were always available for everything. However, I can only assume that it laid the groundwork for more so being allocated to Part 2, and it shows. Both parts are gorgeous, but Part 1 does have its fair share of exposition scenes with relatively little movement, and there is only kind of one big action finale. And while this is great, it is a little lacking in movement every now and again. Part 2 fixes this. It is a refined installation which does a good job of cutting down on some exposition scenes while still keeping us informed and having slightly more action. It is more visually engaging, although that's not to say that Part 1 isn't. Another refinement though that's definitely noticeable is how Part 2 refined the atmosphere of the OVA with small changes put in place. Now, both parts have an extremely grounded setting and atmosphere, but Part 1 is noticeably more grounded, while Part 2 is still grounded but has rather eerie subtexts to it. I honestly don't know which one I like more, they both have their own charms, but I feel like Part 2's probably fits more with the source material and is overall more artistic. In Part 1, we see a normal world in which magic just kind of happens, sort of is a secret science working behind the scenes and impacting people every now and again. But in Part 2, we see a slightly magical take on a world, which just so happens to be the real one. Both are grounded by their settings of 1990s Tokyo and the relatively grounded nature of their plots, simple attempts at bringing a murderer to justice, something which happens in the real world, but Part 2 especially has a slight magical edge to it. And it seems that with a little imagination, Part 2 could be a true story. The scenery, colors, vibes, and everything else of Part 2 are just so slightly off as to give it a subtle but impactful supernatural air, all the while still being something very believable. It feels like there's just something off in the best way possible, and I think the atmosphere in this part especially is amazing. I think it's ironic that Yumiko Masajima, a producer who worked on both pieces, commented on the difficulty faced in nailing the supernatural atmosphere of the manga, when I think that both parts do a very good job of it, even if they don't do it the same way. Where part 1 is a quaint and enjoyable piece though, it's not always the most competent, especially when we examine the audio. It's decent, but it's not the best. The OST is fine, but it's almost bland, I want to say, and the dubbing lets you know that this was definitely something dubbed in the early 90s. Oftentimes, I forgot that there was an OST, and it seemed that some of the production staff forgot to give the voice actors, or at least the English ones, direction every now and again. Part 2's audio though is much improved. Its OST is much more memorable, and the dubbing is much cleaner. It's also apparent that better direction was given as the same VAs sound much more natural in their reprised roles. And the legendary dub mixer, the one and only Dick King, ensures that the sound itself is overall smoother. This is why we watch credits, folks. Anyways, all of this audio technical stuff complements the more animated nature of Part 2 and its overall greater atmosphere. However, both parts are great OVAs that can and should be watched either together or on their own, and are an example of what an OVA often should be. They are small, self-contained stories, offering us a vision into a much more expansive world of the material that they are based upon. They explain enough to make sure that we can follow everything and be involved in this movie, but they're simple enough to not overwhelm us. More importantly, balancing the right level of simplicity and explanation engrosses us into this new world, and this balance is struck perfectly by these two pieces. When I finished watching Part 2, I was all of a sudden super interested in the magical world and characters of Tokyo Babylon. I was all of a sudden interested and wanted to know more about the magic and history of its timeline, to familiarize itself with its mystical mechanics and memorable characters. And that's exactly what an OVA based on a bigger property should do. It should offer a preview of sorts into an amazing new world waiting to be read or watched. If Puppet Princess is an excellent example of an OVA based on very limited or no source material, it's based on a single short story, then Tokyo Babylon is an example of an excellent OVA based on extensive source material, where that source material provides an excellent set of ingredients to make a standalone story to get a viewer engrossed into the world as a whole. In fact, it got me really excited for a possible anime adaptation. While Tokyo Babylon is still remembered today, one of the odder reasons it is so is because it's one of the bigger Clamp pieces that never had an actual anime based upon it. This OVA and some live action piece from 1993 were about all you got in terms of film. Luckily though, I heard an adaptation has been in the works since October of 2020. I've heard they're even halfway done with it as of November of 2021, and I can't wait to see it. Well, at least work will hopefully resume on that soon, and we can see something good come of this debacle. However, until then, at least we can see Subaru and Seishiro appear in X. Oh. Oh no.